Don't you know, don't you know that it's wrong to take what is given you so far gone on your own? Or you could get along if you try to be strong, but you'll never be strong, 'cause you're a rich girl and it's gone too far, 'cause you know it don't matter anyway. You can rely on the old man's money. You can rely on the old man's money. It's a bitch, girl, but it's gone too far, and you know it don't matter anyway. Said money won't get you too far, get you too far. That's hot again. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And this is actually the second of a two-part edition of the New Movie Diary for this week. If you keep in touch with my channel, you'll know that I already reviewed the Irish-language hip-hop music biopic Kneecap previously this week. If you haven't seen that one, give it a look. But we're now ready to move on to the second movie I saw last weekend, Coup, a relatively low-budget satirical black comedy written and directed by Austin Stark and Joseph Schumann, and starring Peter Sarsgaard and Billy Magnuson. Coup opens in New York City in 1918 amidst the outbreak of the influenza pandemic of that year, and we're introduced to Sarsgaard's character in a bar where he steals the identity of a recently deceased man, a cook and a World War I veteran named Floyd Monk, killed by a gunshot wound to the temple. The circumstances suggesting Sarsgaard killed him in order to steal a special travel permit he has acquired to work outside of the heavily quarantined, ravaged New York City and work as a cook in the remote Egg Island Point mansion of a progressive, muckraking journalist by the name of Jay Horton, played by Magnuson. Horton is a staunch critic of then-President Woodrow Wilson, who he accuses in his daily editorials of downplaying the severity of the Spanish flu crisis in order to maintain popular morale in the waning days of the First World War. For his time, Horton even seems to be quite progressive by progressive-era standards, paying particular attention to how the influenza pandemic has disproportionately ravaged communities of color and immigrants in congested urban centers, and offering the only solution as being one in which all civic and commercial life in the city is basically just completely shut down in order that everybody can quarantine and so that the disease cannot be spread. Horton himself is quite wealthy and has taken advantage of his privilege to quarantine himself and his family, his wife Julie, played by Sarah Gordon, but at the same time still continues to write his editorials and reports on the escalating, almost apocalyptic seeming levels of death and violence he claims to witness from the perspective of an on-the-ground reporter, playing himself up as a lone vanguard voice of the working people against powerful elites. Despite his populist politics, he also exercises strict dictatorial control over the estate, maintaining only a small group of servants who are not allowed to drink alcohol, are not allowed to eat meat or hunt on the estate because Horton himself is a vegetarian, are compelled to socially distance from Horton's family, whereas the servants themselves are kept crammed into a single set of quarters for all three of them, including the tutor to Horton's two young children, Mrs. Tidwell, played by Sky P. Marshall, and the groundskeeper, Khan, played by Farhan Tahir. But, of course, when the mischievous Floyd Monk enters the picture, things rapidly start to change. Though Monk himself actually does turn out to be a rather accomplished cook, he more or less immediately goes about attempting to inspire his fellow servants to disobey the Horton's prohibition against alcohol, as well as to organize for better pay and better privileges, especially after a travel lockdown ends up sequestering the entire group to the Egg Island mansion without any possibility of being able to acquire supplies or food except what is grown or hunted on the estate, the latter, of course, being a total no-go for Horton. And though strange and eccentric, Monk is also able to use his charm to begin to win over Julie and Horton's children, and as the hierarchy of Horton's home begins to unravel, he himself himself begins to spiral further and further into paranoia, increasingly convinced that Monk must be some kind of agent of the Wilson government to silence his progressive political agenda. Now, all of this on its surface may seem to be the rather formulaic makings of an unremarkable class war comedy. And it is, to a certain extent. I don't think there's any point in trying to beef up Coup for much more than what it is, especially given how rather obviously it positions itself as a contemporary political allegory, with the circumstances of the 1918 influenza pandemic clearly taking the stage for our own, and I should emphasize, contemporaneous COVID-19 and variant pandemic, and the recent memory of it in terms of how quickly it influenced and shaped so much about American politics, or if anything, about the perception of American politics, especially perceptions of dynamics and oppositions in American politics between conservative and liberal, between revanchist and progressive, all wrapped up into the context of how and what was the right way to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that has influenced attitudes and ideas and conspiracies and paranoias and distrusts and divisions in American politics along this axiom of how we either addressed or failed to address this crisis has totally remade our perceptions of each other and our ability to work with each other for any kind of common political goal. That's the thing. Having also seen Kneecap on the same day as Coup, I guess I had picked both movies randomly, but it once again turned out to be one of those strange kinds of serendipity where you choose two recent films to go see just because they're small and off the beaten track, and end up finding out that there's kind of a similar thematic or structural spirit in them that, whatever the differences in their development and production history, is inevitably related to whatever is percolating in the moment. And in the case of Kneecap and Coup, I basically got to have the opportunity of watching two very different kinds of cinematic, political, and national allegories. In the former case, Kneecap, though presenting itself as just a music biopic about a recent and young hip-hop trio out of Northern Ireland, actually turned out to be a relatively subtle and inspired allegory for the origins and evolution of the present youth counterculture in Northern Ireland. And if you watch my review of it, I get into that a little more about how the movie uses this embellished telling of the story of the band to portray the kind of strange, heterodox position of these young people in Northern Ireland as they attempt to define their own sense of national pride and identity in the wake of the Troubles and their own generational alienation from that history. Whereas a movie like Coup is simply a much more obvious kind of political allegory, and in fact, it's attempting to be as obvious as possible. It's probably fair to say that it's the kind of political allegory that is so popular in American film and television specifically, but also so obvious that I can easily imagine most of my viewers who didn't know about the movie rolling their eyes all the way back into their skulls and out from under again. And I get the feeling, I get it. What? We're actually doing this? We're doing this where we just take present political schisms in the wake of a pandemic and transpose it onto an older one? I'm not going to say that it's an unfair allegory. It's not like there are no parallels between the transformational political period of which the influenza pandemic was a part and directly influenced, and our own experience of COVID-19 in the early 21st century. I think we can all admit that the nearly centennial anniversary of when the influenza and COVID-19 pandemics broke out is in itself a bit poetic. It's not that it's an unfair allegory, it's that it's obvious, and quite frankly, so obvious that you really only need a passing awareness of the history of the influenza pandemic, or even just the progressive era in early 20th century American politics in general, to start rolling your eyes at the coup. Like, it becomes immediately easy because of how obvious the allegory is to start poking holes in the dramatic embellishments of the storytelling of this film, where the facts are fudged just a little too far, a little too obviously, and quite frankly, a little too patronizingly to be taken completely seriously, even in the context of this kind of very in-your-face, very wearing the idea on its sleeve, satirical black comedy. Coup is the type of movie that takes place in 1918 and depicts New York City as this ravaged, hollowed-out core where bodies from the slums and tenements are simply being loaded onto the backs of trucks, and where businesses have been shut down completely as part of quarantine measures. Whereas the reality is that the outbreak of influenza in New York City didn't even really get that bad until the following year, and even then there were no, citywide shutdowns of businesses. They basically just staggered business hours to avoid public transportation congestion, which is actually the exact same thing that New York City basically did with COVID-19. Most major businesses were not, in fact, completely shut down, and if they were shut down, they were only shut down for a relatively small amount of time, definitely disastrous for the people who own those businesses, but more or less were shut down to a degree that were then encouraged to, okay, after this window, now we're just going to stagger the hours to avoid congestion. Really, the whole idea of these giant shutdowns, we all know this by now, this isn't something that really actually happened. This is a bugbear of right-wing conspiracy theorists. It's something that they say happened, but didn't even really actually happen that way. And of course, if this movie is attempting to be a satire, if it's attempting to be this black comic political allegory, it's basically managing to get the facts of two completely different eras completely wrong, and I guess just at a baseline for really kind of cynical reasons, just because it's an easy trick to pull, it's an easy fact to fudge. Whereas how New York City actually dealt with both influenza and COVID-19 was basically by banning mass gatherings, encouraging mask wearing and methods of social distancing and air circulation, sequenced but non-mandatory inoculations. Try to stop me if any of this gets familiar. That's what actually happened. Don't get me wrong, the influenza pandemic was definitely bad, but the sort of capsule hyperbolic presentation of it in Coup sort of points to its biggest flaw, which is its kind of grating obviousness as an allegorical film, even to the degree that it's not even really functioning as an allegory because it's not relating events that actually happened to events that actually happened. It's an allegory and a satire that takes place entirely or almost entirely within the realms of political fantasies, within political paranoias, within conspiracy theories. Horton in the film itself is also very obviously a progressive figure as derived from our contemporary understanding of what it means to be politically progressive in the early 21st century, as opposed to what it actually would have reference to in the actual progressive era. Obviously, there's some shared political tradition between the progressive era and what we call progressive politics currently, but of course, there were basically very few people, even crusading muckrakers in the early 20th century, whose politics were quite like Horton's in this film. Back then, being progressive meant a whole host of things that were all related to this generalized obsession with the idea of social improvement and social hygiene and social betterment and progress in the abstract without those politics and policies being attenuated to a single political spectrum like they are today, where if someone says they're progressive, you assume that they are liberal or leftist. Whereas progressivism, the progressive era, gave birth both to modern sort of bourgeois anti-communist liberalism, but also to variants of bourgeois socialism, but also to fascism. Like, this is a tree that branched out in a lot of different directions. Back then, being progressive could mean that you favored equal rights for Negroes, but it could also mean you were literally in favor of sterilizing all of Harlem. This sort of ivory tower screedwriter, as portrayed in Coup, is just a little too obviously a cartoon of progressive politics now, now, and seems to be especially obviously a reference to a much more contemporary, satiric idea of a college-educated rich boy who plays the proletarian advocate on his podcast, but is otherwise completely divorced from and alienated from the struggles of actual working people, many of whom, like the monk character, they're the literal muckrakers, not the metaphorical muckrakers, and their politics are not attenuated to a specific progressive ideal, and in fact, they often may be very, very closed off and conservative and not terribly concerned with the idea that you can invent ways to improve upon society or the basics of the human condition, which is so much a part of what progressive politics was in that era and how it directly informed our contemporary politics, again, on both sides of the political spectrum. Anyway, this is how we get this escalating antagonism with Monk, who, though still quite ominous as a figure, increasingly takes on in the movie this anti-heroic color as he continues to expose Horton's hypocrisy and narcissism and also his incompetence. I'm going to go back to a line that I heard in the movie 7 Days in Entebbe. Basically, the line goes, "One plumber is worth 10 revolutionaries." That's sort of the valence that this movie is on in terms of its portrayal of this antagonism. And none of this is to say that I think that because of the kind of obviousness and generally the flatness and unconvincing nature of the sort of very abstract and, again, perception-focused allegory the filmmakers are trying to create here, that doesn't mean I necessarily think Coup is a bad movie. As a matter of fact, I quite liked it. I think Stark and Schumann's script is very well written, even if it is not terribly accurate to either era. Again, I am open to the idea that it's a satire that is engaging in the abstract, that is engaging in extremes of ideas and caricatures and not necessarily what is actually tenable. The only really overbearing parts of the script are the parts that are supposed to be overbearing and pretentious, which is to say the narration of Horton's editorial screeds against the government and in favor of nationwide business closures and lockdowns to contain the spread of the virus. Whereas I think pretty much everywhere else, Stark and Schumann show a real good ear for dialogue that treads just the right line between grandiose style and a more mundane, naturalistic kind of writing. The performances in the film are definitely up to par in terms of bringing all these characters to life and making them feel plausible and natural, even when the sort of obvious allegorical framework doesn't. And for its budget, and this is a production that is kind of biting off a lot, I will say that Coup is rather convincing in terms of immersing you into this world, of making you feel like you could be in the early 20th century, even when Stark and Schumann kind of can't help themselves but to shout from the rooftops that this is an allegory, this is using our applied knowledge from AP history to write a cinematic essay on present political schisms. But here's the thing. Because the filmmakers are so clearly invested in that sort of more abstract allegorical framework and in making it as obvious as possible, it kind of ironically makes Coup a much more exciting and interesting movie than it would otherwise be, because the temporal sense of the movie, its sense of consistency with the values of a historical moment versus what are clearly just obsessions of the present historical moment, is so out of whack that it kind of accidentally becomes, and this is the only way I can describe it, it basically becomes like an American version of Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, but like if a MAGA guy wrote it. And I say accidentally only because I'm genuinely not sure if writer-directors Austin Stark and Joseph Schumann might actually be crypto-fascists, or at the very least filmmakers on that sort of reactionary provocateur wavelength of a Craig S. Zoller, for instance, or if Coup is maybe just so beautifully discombobulated as a political allegory that it just can't help but seem like it's doing reactionary dog whistle stuff when it's actually all Stark and Schumann are trying to do is some middle-of-the-road liberal centrist whinging about how divided we are as a country or whatever. At a certain point, if Coup really is a dog whistle reactionary film, you might as well replace those dog whistles with an entire ska band brass section, because number one, the movie is called Coup. And I didn't think about this when I was deciding to go see it, and I didn't think about it for about the first half of the movie. But at a certain point, I started thinking, in the context of this movie, in which we have this grifter, slum dwelling, but actually rather hyper competent anti hero played by Sarsgaard, who seems malicious, but is also very down to earth and naturally inclined to rebellion, and very charismatic with his fellow working people, and actually really competent both as a working man in the kitchen, as well as with a rifle when everything gets locked down and it's time to hunt and to clean. You have this guy walking into this Nancy boy candy rich guy's house, the house of this guy whose strongest political position is just this obsessive quarantine away from the world. He just wants all businesses to be shut down completely. Our anti-hero comes in and starts messing with this guy's whole program, and the movie is called Coup, and it's like, okay, but where have you been hearing the term coup bandied about for the better part of 4 years now? It gets even stranger, though, because there's literally a part of the movie where Horton catches Monk bathing in his pool, his indoor pool, and is just incensed by this guy. And Monk is just completely unfazed. He knows he controls the situation now. He knows that Horton can't do anything about it. And it's at this point that Monk literally turns to Horton and mawkishly tells him, "You're fired." As in, you can't fire me. You're the one who's useless. You're out of here. But also? Clearly these are references to Trumpian MAGA stuff, right? Clearly the coup of the title is an allegorical coup by this reactionary figure against this elite progressive rich guy who keeps clamoring about how the government won't follow his advice, whereas in the warped presentation by the filmmakers of the history of the influenza pandemic in New York City, the local government at least is already implementing the draconian quarantine and shutdown policies he wants. And because I don't really care about spoiling too much at this point, how much you want to bet that the closing of a small business and the destroying of lives turns out to be a very important character twist in the climax? I probably should be a little more critical of Coup because, again, it could be some kind of weird crypto-fascist film. At the very least, I should be more critical than I am because, okay, if you're this incompetent at political allegory, if all you're trying to do is make this kind of soapy, liberal, centrist class warfare comedy that comments on how awful and intractable our present social and political divisions are, but you maybe accidentally make a fascist anti-hero movie if you accidentally make MAGA Parasite. But at the same time, I gotta say, I think that's exactly what I like so much about it. Coup is quite well written in terms of basic prose. It has a great narrative structure that really keeps you locked in and invested. The characters are really well defined. It is overall a pretty fun movie experience, but it's also just so politically silly and clearly far more calculated and thus potentially dangerous that I kind of want to take too seriously. Spoiler alert, I don't care about spoiling this stuff because it honestly might be a more enjoyable movie for most people if they know it plays like MAGA Parasite. But it becomes a major symbolic point in the climax when Horton the vegetarian literally needs to eat rare meat, literal red meat, in order to get the upper hand against Monk. He basically needs to go Popeye mode by eating some venison. I can already see Slavoj Žižek loving this movie. You see, in order to fully combat the fascist aggressor, you first need to be able to eat the red meat. There is a kind of Vulgarian poetry to Coup that, even if all the other qualities about the film are at best pretty good, and even if there are some genuinely dumb and obvious aspects of it, there is a kind of Vulgarian poetry to it that overcomes those flaws quite a bit and makes this a very special movie in terms of how we watch the evolution of politics and political schisms being represented in our popular cinema, and especially in our commercial independent cinema, especially as our cinema attempts to mediate that present rise in, if not out-and-out fascism, then certainly a kind of fascist adjacent or at least liberal ambivalence in the face of fascism, which I think best describes the satiric undercurrent of Coup. It's not that it's really a MAGA Parasite. By its end, it is ultimately a very fatalistic and pessimistic movie. Definitely entertaining enough as a black comedy and a chamber thriller on its own, but with the added bonus of playing with really obvious political imagery in a really wild way, I think I'll give Coup a 3.5 out of 5, which makes it, at the very least, another pretty good allegorical film of the double feature of allegorical films I saw last weekend. With that, I'm going to sign off. If you've seen Coup, let me know what you thought of it in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? If you liked this video, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.